is Brandon Tiltz, and this is a Feather of Light podcast. Today, I figure I'll jump into the topic of parts work, which, if some of you followed some of my Instagram reels, this is something that I use quite a bit in my personal life, in my own healing process. When I'm in a counseling session with my counselor, I like to use the language of when I'm talking to a part of me, or if there's a part of me that's, let's just say, seeking control or looking for a way to, just look at have different perspective on something that I'm actively trying to heal. And of course, I at times apply this language or this model to working with coaching clients or with my future counseling clients. So what is parts work? Parts work is also known as, it's kind of has like a specific name brand. So internal family systems is how Richard Schwartz would name parts work. But I like to refer to it as parts work more generally because they don't really like for you to claim the title or the role of a IFS therapist unless you have specific training or specific credentials to do so. But using parts work, applying the language as a tool, that's universally known as fair game among coaches or counselors and otherwise. Now, how is parts work applied? Well, parts work is basically a series of meditations, as you can find on YouTube or sometimes on Insight Meditation Timer, or there's other platforms to which you could find guided meditations for parts work. But really what they're doing is they're allowing you to create this dialogue with your parts. And what parts are, in a sense, is they're these fragmented versions of you that often are rooted in childhood. And a good common example most people understand, or at least could reference, is when they speak to their inner child. When they speak about their inner child needing something from them and maybe on some level feeling like it's not being loved or received by a person in their life, and they need to kind of, in a way, advocate for the needs of their inner child. And in parts work, this type of part would be what's referred to as an exile part. And an exile part is really just that, a part that has been exiled from the rest of the system, and in a way is being sheltered and protected. And not oftentimes it's not like the exile is the one that we will bring to the surface or communicate with in most therapy sessions, or even really acknowledge exists, because it's so vulnerable and it's so essentially fragile and delicate, and we treat it as such. Well, maybe it's not as much as it's delicate and fragile, but we treat it like it's delicate. We treat it like it's something that needs to be protected. And that's how our whole life, in a way, has been to protect this part. Like we've created a system, a defense mechanism sometimes is called, but I think the system is a better word for it. But we've created an effective defense matrix, really, of all these clusters of inner versions of us that all have essentially different influence over us in our life. And they're doing so to protect this vulnerable, scared, inner childlike parts that from our understanding, really need to be controlled or put into like a box or protected with walls. And that's kind of how parts works, or how it functions, and why it is such a valuable tool in therapy or sometimes in coaching, is because we're trying to not always access the exile, but on some level have a dialogue with the parts that feel like they need to protect this wounded inner child that oftentimes reacts in very extreme ways. So the characteristics of the exile part are often that it holds onto a tremendous amount of shame, and it has beliefs that are very extreme and see the world as out to hurt them, and they live in a victim mindset for the most part. And they see things sometimes in terms of all or nothing, like people love me or people hate me. And just recognizing that this is a part of us, that if we can create more of a dialogue with it or have more acceptance for it, then we can begin to respond to this part and actually give it space and give it love and give it support, versus further exiling that part from the rest of our system. So another really important dynamic that exists within parts work is the existence of what's called self, spelt with a capital S. So self, it's what it sounds like in a way, it's you, but it's the you that's has not been wounded and is in a sense untouched by the trauma and the abuse and the experiences that you've went throughout your life. So the self is this capacity to tap into and attune to sort of like a higher power, or your higher self is another way of thinking of it. It's the higher self. But this self also knows how to parent your internal system. It understands these parts intuitively. It understands the wounds on a deeper level. It understands how to tap into a deeper sense of connectedness to the whole system. So like a good parent, it can be calm when it needs to be calm. It can communicate from a place of clarity and confidence and compassion. So I would say another way of looking at this is it's like you have this inner healer, right? Your inner, whatever, coach, counselor, shaman, whatever you want to name it. It's this inner healer that knows how to essentially regulate your internal system. It understands what is needed to create harmony among these parts that, by the way, they kind of operate like a family. That's why it's called internal family systems. And if you think about families, oftentimes, if there's a dysfunctional family, at least, there's a lack of leadership. There's a lot of conflicts, and maybe I would say these are due to a lack of leadership within the system, a lack of a strong patriarch or matriarch who embodies what, according to parts work, would be self-energy, right? The capacity to regulate the children, the capacity to create emotional safety, the capacity to attune to their emotional experience and validate their experience. And when there's a lack of that, it's kind of like you got two children in the room, right? You got a dad or a mom who's kind of just like on the defensive, and they're not necessarily creating the safety and remaining curious and remaining open and remaining in a place of confidence and compassion, that's where there's a lack of what, according to this theory, is self-energy. So where was I going with this? Essentially, your family system was essentially what created the necessity for the way your internal system functions. So the belief systems, for instance, that your family unit held, like, we do this. This is how the world is. This is how you ought to behave. This is what determines whether you're a good little boy or a good little girl or whatever. It's really about, this is how we perceive the world from our kind of unique systems, set of agreements and worldviews. So those beliefs, often when you experience those types of beliefs when you were a kid, when you were a child, that's how you started to view the world. That's how you viewed, this is how I get my needs met. This is how I keep myself safe. This is what emotional safety feels like or doesn't feel like. And these kind of unwritten rules, they get passed on and start to essentially create the foundation for how you live your life, how you interact with other people, how you interact with your own internal working system. Which, by the way, sometimes these parts will mimic the personalities of the family figures or the role models. So for instance, you could have a part that feels and acts very similar to the way your dad acted when you were a child, or maybe when when you're older. It depends on your relationship with them if they're still alive, right? Or another part that mimics the same dynamic that your mom had in your life, the same role that she had in your life, and so on with your sister or brother, or so on with certain relationships, if they're really impactful and long-standing relationships. So these parts are, functional. They're operating in a way that you deem as the most effective way of maintaining control or maintaining harmony or maintaining balance within your life. And it's important to recognize them as such. So as Richard Schwartz puts it, there are no bad parts. There are no evil parts. And when we exile the parts or demonize the parts, what we're actually doing is we're telling that part to fuck off. We're telling that part that it's not allowed to be a part of your system, or you reject it as being a part of your system. And the result of that is often a disconnect from, let's just say, this dialogue, right? There's a working dialogue you're having with these parts, usually behind the scenes. But what you're doing in parts work is you're taking that behind the scenes dialogue and you're gradually introducing it to conscious awareness. And by the way, this looks kind of weird for most people if they've never, quote unquote, talked to themselves. They've never sat there and had a dialogue with their own inner personality archetypes or parts. Because you have to really entertain the idea that our mind, according to parts work, our mind operates in what's called multiplicity. And what multiplicity implies is that our brains don't just function as a singular form of consciousness. It's not just one linear thought process. Our mind, according to this theory, it operates in a way that cross-communicates and collaborates with different fragmented systems, different parts that all I would propose could actually be neurologically mapped if this were possible, if you had the resources or ability to do so. But you could map how these different functions essentially are expressed within the brain. But anyway, so each of these different sections, parts, whatever, they cross-communicate and they collaborate to form our sense of identity, the conclusions that we reach, the interpretations about the world that we have, and of course, the emotional reactions that we uphold or express. So this is just a little bit of an insight into what IFS actually is and how parts work actually functions behind the scenes, whether you recognize it or not. There's a lot of different labels for these things, right? And oftentimes we can get around these labels. We can choose our own different ways of working with the parts, or working with the emotional experience, or the somatic imprint within the body. So, I mean, various therapists have different languages for this. I came across a social worker who she talked about how she would get high, she'd get stoned, because sometimes it's easier to access these parts in altered states. I do it sober, of course, but it was kind of like a game. Like for them, it was a game. And the game was to start to entertain that they were talking to their mom or talking to another part of them. They just didn't use that language. So it's interesting when you start to consider where your mind might just organically start to, intuitively really, it starts to communicate in this way. And this was how parts was originally developed. It was actually used to treat eating disorders. And Richard Schwartz is a psychologist who works with a family systems approach. So he trained in a way to work with families, but he also worked with individuals. He worked with this individual that had eating disorders, different individuals who had eating disorders. So then essentially through talking with them about the way that the process would unravel or unfold. So, the binge eating would be one stage, and then after the fact they would be bulimic, essentially. So the bulimia, the second stage, it would kind of like flood through their system like another part that just would full on take control, and it would need to compulsively do this thing to rid them of anxiety or rid them of the feelings that they were having about themselves. And it was kind of like a switch would go off, and then they would essentially be in a different state. And this was kind of the origin of how these parts work, how the parts work system was created, was just listening to people who would start to describe in depth these parts. And Richard Schwartz just took that same idea and took that model and rolled with it and created a system around it and created, different therapeutic tools, I would say, like, guided meditations. You can map out parts using different elaborate systems. For example, I want to bring clients into a space of doing art therapy. So essentially being able to paint out different parts or create maps that represent the whole working system, or, different ways that you can access the parts and externalize them in a way that isn't necessarily just speaking to them directly and getting their names and writing each of them down, which is part of the process too, but that can take a lot of time, and that can be very confusing for some. And sometimes people's parts aren't that willing to openly express, and art in various forms can be a beautiful way to sort of bypass the mind, to kind of get out of your head and just express things and just feel more safe in the creative realm. Oftentimes, this is something I learned in school when I was studying to become a counselor, oftentimes our mind doesn't want to get into these emotional spaces, or it's uncomfortable speaking some of these more uncomfortable truths. And if we're able to use a creative tool, or sometimes a metaphor, that's how metaphors work in therapy, you're able to bypass the mind. You're able to get into the creative sphere. You're able to create that safety for a person to explore something in an abstract way that still allows them to go into that space, but they're doing it with a little bit more spaciousness being created. They're not directly speaking to it. They don't necessarily have to get as vulnerable in a direct way, so that they can essentially allow exploration space for, whatever they got to get into, like, complex emotions like grief or shame or, the experience of trauma and the invalidation that comes along with that, like complex trauma, like I mentioned the other one. It's not a simple experience to express. And when you start to unpack it, when you start to really speak to it, there's so much going on in the mind, and it gets so confusing that sometimes you just need to get into the body. Sometimes you just need to get into a place of like safety within the nervous system. It's not even about really necessarily speaking to the thing directly, just experiencing safety, experiencing being witnessed, experiencing being validated, and feeling how your body feels as the result of that validation. Or of course, doing some art, doing some movement, right? Like ecstatic dances, yoga, somatic tools like breath work for release, various different tools. So these are some things I apply, some things I've experienced directly, and these can be used in tandem with parts work to help a person, any person, get deeper into the experience of knowing themselves, of accepting themselves, of understanding the nuances of their emotional experience. So, yeah, I guess just to end on the note of if you are curious about IFS, feel free to reach out if you have any questions. Do my best to answer anything that I do know, but there's many things that I do not know as well. I'm not an expert. I don't proclaim to be one, but at the same time, I'm actively learning. I'm actively exploring this tool within my own experience. I've actually had some pretty profound breakthroughs on my own, and I guess I do my best to really just humble myself and recognize that this is a vast world to which I am always curious. I'm always tapping into my own capacity to explore and understand things differently. And I learn a lot from working with my parts. I learn a lot from working with other people's parts. And I learn a lot from expressing myself with art too. And another exercise I've done, and I would like to bring people into more so, is where you paint a painting and then you interview that painting like it's a part. Like you start to talk to the art, see what the art has to say to you directly, if you're essentially using that art as a way to channel and respond to your initial inquiries and your initial curiosities. And this takes a little bit of, I'd say, familiarity with talking with your parts, or even just like exploring art in general, because you're not trying to interpret your art. You're not trying to judge it. You're not trying to figure it out. You're just exploring it very openly, asking what the art might be trying to tell you, or on some level, like what you feel through the experience of the art. And this is where it gets into kind of like an art therapy process, but I would say it's as simple as just you're interviewing this painting. You're interviewing this piece of creative expression and seeing what part is connected to that, or parts that are connected to that piece. And I would propose you can learn quite a bit from that process of just getting curious, creating that space, and playing in this realm of creativity, playing in this realm of awe, because this is a really beautiful tool. It is a modality, but it's also just a tool for just exploring your world differently, for getting curious about like, what is the nature of consciousness? What is the nature of expression? What does it really mean or signify or represent in a way when you're creating something, a painting, a sculpture, a poem, anything? When you're moving, right? When you're moving your body, when you're being led through by your, let's just say, whatever is leading you through your movement, you're being led through an orchestration of movement and dance and flow and connecting to essentially the message, I suppose. There's like a message that your expression is trying to, I suppose, unlock. And that, yeah. So anyway, not to tangent too much, but IFS and expression, I would say these are the ways I've done most of my healing, most of my integration. And the most effective healing from my experience is not from plant medicine ceremonies or deep psychedelic doses necessarily. It's what follows that experience. It's your capacity to really use that momentum to unlock something within the body, to receive the download fully through the experience of exploring yourself, exploring what shifted in your mind, what shifted in your body, and really just having the openness to really follow that experience through in a way, like kind of like allow it to fully unravel to the point of wherever it essentially you're trying to go. So I hope this exploration was helpful. Maybe you learned something about parts work. Maybe you learned something about art therapy. Maybe you learned something about yourself. And maybe this was just a good space for you to listen, and maybe something came up and you were able to reflect on something a little bit differently. And if so, awesome. I appreciate that. That's what this space is for. And appreciate you tuning in and checking out the podcasts, and lots more to come. Sending you lots of love on your journey of healing, and take care for now. Bye.